Thank you. Good evening. How's everybody? It's really a pleasure for me to start with Ochoa. I, for the first time, saw her in San Juan, Puerto Rico at the National Women's Studies Association conference, and she was speaking on some pieces from this book, which I quickly read right afterwards. And the text is just a careful, thoughtful, respectful ethnography that includes the norms and ideals, the abject, the marginal, the ways people try to survive. And it's beautifully rendered in terms of looking at scales of the transnational, the national, and the body. And all I could think when I was reading the text is, this is exactly the sorts of things that we care about in the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. So I'm really pleased that Professor Ochoa has been able to join us. But let me tell you a little bit about her before she speaks. She's chair of the Feminist Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she has multiple affiliations, which I have to turn to my notes to recall. One is critical race and ethnic studies, Latin American and Latino studies, and the departments of anthropology and film, the departments of anthropology and film and digital media. At Santa Cruz, she's taught such courses as transgender studies, queer diasporas, feminist theories, transgender bodies, social science research, genders and sexualities in Latino Americas, mediating desire, and ways of seeing and hearing. Her scholarship focuses on the role of the imaginary in the survival of queer and transgender people in Latin America and the place of these subjects in the nation. And what's really striking to me as I read through Professor Ochoa's publications and accomplishments is that she negotiates particular politics that responsible anthropologists need to keep in mind, and many scholars need to keep in mind, which is that of who is one's audience. Located as she is in the United States, she's published in many flagship journals in English. But concerned with dialogue in South America and Venezuela specifically, she has published much of her work as well in Spanish in critical venues in South America. And that's a mark of a real scholar who can move between different contexts. Beyond Santa Cruz and beyond her publishing, Professor Ochoa also works with an NGO in San Francisco, La para Translatinas, which develops HIV prevention and violence prevention programming and promotes trans-Latina participation that, in the words of Professor Ochoa, reflect the style and grace of transgender Latina survival. And I should add as well that she's recently co-edited a special issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly called Decolonizing the Transgender Imaginary, and she has co-edited 2 special issues of GLQ, both titled On the Visceral. And equally important, she has just assumed the co-editorship for 5 years of GLQ, or Gay and Lesbian Quarterly. But please join me in welcoming Professor Ochoa. I hope you enjoy her talk.
Thank you. Just make sure I have all the tech ready. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. So I really very much appreciate the invitation and the wonderful colleagues here at Georgia State. Especially thank you to Tiffany King and Susan Taubert, as well as Andy Reisinger, who's helping us do all of the processing and paperwork for this visit. Which we all know is substantial always. I'm going to move through the introduction of the. Does it need to be louder? Oh, it's not on. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's better. Okay. So I'm going to move through the beginning part, and then I have a sort of extended excerpt. I was trying to decide. You always have to kind of think about your audience when you're thinking about what part of the book to read. And I have a lot of different favorite parts of the book, and I thought at first that it would be one thing, and then sort of throughout the course of the day decided it should be another part. So I'm going to read from the last full chapter in the book before the epilogue. It's called on the sorry, not on the visceral. It's called a spectacular femininity, and it's thinking through the question of spectacle and femininity together. And it's kind of, if you follow feminist theory and are interested in performativity, it's sort of my way of thinking about performativity in at least the sort of the realm of spectacle. But to get there, I need to create some context for you. So I'm going to start by telling you the story about how I started on this project to begin with. It's 1998, and I find myself on a crowded airplane in San Antonio del Táchira, on the border between Colombia and Venezuela. Through a complicated series of events that involves a canceled bus trip and a cousin without the proper papers, I'm flying through the Juan Vicente Gomez International Airport to visit family living on Isla Margarita, a tourist resort in the Venezuelan Caribbean. It's my firm belief that as a queer child of a diasporic Colombian family with branches in the United States, Colombia, and Venezuela, I am uniquely positioned to witness the spectacle that unfolds before me. A new flight crew comes aboard in San Antonio. A young woman, tall, gaunt, and arduously stylized, takes command of the cabin. Her close-fitting polyester uniform is crisp and gleaming. Hat cocked precariously atop a mound of hair immaculately pulled back into a moño with two precise spit curls gelled down along her mandible, tapering off into whisper-thin points. Her eyebrows are cleanly plucked and delineated in black pencil, a bemused arch against the moderately applied foundation, the color of café con leche, that coats the skin of her face. Her lips, dripping with a mocha-tinged red, pout as she proceeds to give a performance of the airline safety procedures, such as I have never seen before. Every gesture is studied and designed, it seems, to cast an aura of glamour over the rows of weary travelers. And yet, our flight attendant seems not the least bit interested in her charge's reactions. She makes no eye contact, staring intently at the exit signs at the rear of the plane, as the baubles on her wrists jangle with the motion of the instructions. It seems that the aisle of the airplane in her mind has become a runway. As our plane sits on the San Antonio airstrip, the flight attendant seems to be referencing the runway walk and poise of the beauty queens who have been a national obsession in Venezuela. From my place among the travelers, I watch the flight attendant and marvel at her behavior, a form of femininity completely alien to my own gender presentation. At this moment, the thread of the inquiry that this book represents begins to show itself. How might we make sense of beauty and femininity and glamour in Venezuela? How might these discourses lead a young woman to act the way she did on our flight? How might we make sense of her performance in front of a plane load of people, we who were her audience, but not quite? Was she alone in this kind of comportment? What does a person stand to gain by invoking an air of glamour the way this flight attendant did? In Venezuela, you would call someone who acted the way she did a miss. This is an appropriation of the English word miss, like in Miss Universe, into Spanish. A miss is a contestant in a beauty pageant or someone who looks or acts like they could be. If you wanted to talk to this flight attendant, you could say to her, "Eres toda una miss." You are such a miss. She would probably take it as a compliment. I think of miss as one of the genders I encountered in my work in Venezuela. This flight attendant's everyday performance strikes me in particular because it recalls how the divas in my own queer Latino community invoke glamour by reordering time and space to center on a silent gestural language that might be as direct and powerful as an arched eyebrow. Not everyone acts this way, and certainly not all of those who try are successful at invoking glamour. Although the flight attendant's performance may seem trivial, perhaps even frivolous, it reflects an important facet of the project of self-making, the ways we style ourselves and our bodies in dialogue with mass media spectacle. Though the flight attendant was not on a screen, nor in front of a live studio audience, she styled her performance of femininity using the conventions of modeling and what I call spectacular femininity. The flight safety routine is an everyday instance of the connections among media, nation, gender, and bodies. Though the flight attendant was cisgender and not a transgender woman, as far as I could tell, her performance reminded me of the glamour with which many transgender Latinas, gay men, and femme lesbians in my own community carry themselves. This is not because any of these people is copying the other, but rather because all were using similar symbolic resources to produce and perform femininity. For example, many of these different people would use similar kinds of hand or eye gestures, makeup, posture, and other techniques to create the effect of glamour. It's how these symbolic resources become available and the uses to which they're put that have become a central concern for me. Queen for a Day winds its way through these initial questions surrounding the national beauty pageant in Venezuela and its relationship to the production of femininity in order to explore the cultural logics and embodied practices through which Venezuelan femininity becomes material. I'm going to say briefly that one of my methodological approaches in this book is called queer diasporic ethnography. And so I want to say a little bit about that. I can talk about that in the question and answer period also. The flight attendant spectacle is only one part of the scene. The other part is about what I was doing on that plane. It's not completely by chance that I came to be sitting on a plane on the tarmac of the Juan Vicente Gomez Airport at the border of Colombia and Venezuela, nor that I made note of the flight attendant's spectacular performance. It was a kind of observation I was particularly attuned to within my questions about what it meant to be queer, a butch woman, and from this place. I was flying to Venezuela because I wanted to cross the wide gulf that separated me as a queer, as an immigrant to the United States, from the extended family we had left behind upon our migration. I was on the plane because I was making the first moves to understand how I am a product of this place with its own perversions and displacements. In this way, I situate this project as a queer diasporic ethnography. This is one of the methods I use. Another couple of caveats around gender terminology. I approached gender in this project empirically. That is, I did not presume that the gender categories with which I was familiar would be the gender categories that operated in Venezuela. Instead, I looked at what gender categories were operative in the different sites in this study, both among the trans women with whom I worked and in the context of the national beauty pageant. For the sake of clarity, I defined the key genders that inhabit this book here: transformistas and misses. I've already mentioned what a miss is. Transformista is a term used in many parts of Latin America. In Brazil, it's used to refer to cross-dressers or transvestites, a quite different set of people from the travesti, a feminine gender category used to refer to people who were assigned male sex at birth, who have been the focus of so much ethnographic attention. I was supposed to go forward here. In Argentina and Spain, the word transformista is used to refer to female impersonators on stage. In Venezuela, a transformista is a person who is typically assigned male sex at birth, but who from an early age begins to transform her body to express her femininity. She does this by plucking her eyebrows, using makeup, wearing clothes designed for women, and doing women's work, as well as sometimes taking hormones and getting breast implants and other plastic surgeries. The word transformista has associations with the sex work performed by many transformistas and is considered an insult by some, although it's also used for self-definition. Transformistas are engaged in a project of transformation, and their changes are often made silently. There is no coming out moment as we often see in a North American identity formation model. Instead, there's a series of actions that lead to the inevitable result, the transformation of a male-assigned body into a transformista body. Transformistas fit within the wider analytical concept of transgender, although this concept is relatively new to Venezuela. I've also used the term, I've seen people use the term transgender or transgender, a Spanish appropriation of the term in English, as a way to differentiate themselves from transformistas. I define transgender in English as a general category that refers to people who take identitarian, physical, and social measures to express a gender that society says does not belong to the sex assigned to them at birth. Transformistas fit within this definition, but obviously not all transgender people are transformistas. Transformistas, like other Venezuelan women, assemble their notions of femininity from their bodies, their environments, the expectations placed on them by their communities, their own ideas about the currency of specific forms of femininity, mass media, and the material forms of production available for the project of accomplishing femininity. This study asks, how is femininity accomplished? Through what practices, technologies, and ideologies does a feminine subject become intelligible? how are transgender and cisgender femininities produced in the same discursive frame? In Venezuela, I found a very centralized production process for the national beauty pageant, Miss Venezuela, which allowed me to trace how this iconic figure of femininity for the nation has been produced. If you haven't heard about it, Miss Venezuela is the most celebrated national beauty pageant in that it has won the largest number of international beauty pageant titles of any country, 11 so far, and I had to keep changing the number every year after they won another one. This pageant is produced by Venevisión, a national broadcast channel and a subsidiary of Univision, owned by the Cisneros Group of corporations, one of the largest media holdings in Latin America. In many ways, Mrs. Transformistas in the nation of Venezuela have something in common. They all use beauty and glamour to negotiate power and marginality. Of course, beauty and glamour are not the only tools available for this negotiation, but they are useful tools for Transformistas, Mrs., and for Venezuela as a nation. Let me just switch slides. Venezuela changed its image as an out-of-the-way place in the 20th century through the beauty pageant industry. Individually, Transformistas and Mrs. create possibilities for themselves through beauty and glamour. The ways Transformistas and Mrs. employ these tools have taught me about the power of dreams and glamour in the micropolitics of gender. I realized that to think about media and the body and to understand how beauty and femininity come to have meaning in Venezuela, we have to think at different orders of magnitude. Some things are so big they escape our geographic borders. Other things are so particular to our bodies and how we shape them that they are often as close up as a plastic eyelash. So I came up with 3 orders of magnitude. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides here to get to that. This is another illustration from a series about the beauty pageant in Venezuela that just demonstrates the power of beauty pageants in Venezuela to create place and a sense of belonging, pride for people who are typically marginalized from the aesthetic of beauty, as are transgender women and women of African descent in Venezuela. So I'll also skip through this media studies framework bit. But if you're interested in media studies, I'm happy to talk during Q&A. The chapter excerpt is going to have a lot about spectacle and spectatorship. So this is the organization of the book, right? The 3 orders of magnitude are on the transnational, which has 2 chapters, one about the history of the Venezuelan beauty contest and the emergence of the idea of that there could be a queen of Venezuela, a Miss Venezuela. The second is about this the idea of transnational sort of mobility, but also what does it mean to consider and center the trans subject in thinking about the nation, right? The second section, on the runway, on the street, is a sort of scenic level of analysis, in which we in which women are staged to various ends. The main site where this happens is the runway. This is called the pasarela in Spanish. It's also the term that's used to describe someone's runway walk. So you walk on a pasarela, a runway, but if you are a beauty contestant or model, you also have pasarela, the way you walk runway. In these chapters, I describe how a runway is set up and how beauty pageants are staged, and explore the form of the beauty pageant, something anthropologists pay particular attention to, most famously when we are looking at rituals. I think of the beauty pageant as a kind of media ritual. And then I discuss Avenida Libertador, which we'll read about I'll read about a little bit today, where I met one of my key informants, who I call La Contessa, and where I learned how transformistas use pasarelas they find there to project themselves into the urban imaginary of Caracas. The third order of magnitude on the body describes the technologies and practices of embodiment that Mrs. and transformistas use to accomplish their femininities. The first chapter of this section, Sacar el Cuerpo, or bringing out the body, looks specifically at technologies of the body and considers the idea of carnality, the messy processes through which our bodies are placed in society, and social ideologies emerge as marks on our bodies. The second chapter is focused, this is the one I'll be reading, chapter 6, on how we signify femininity with our bodies and gestures, and what it means to be spectacular. So I'll turn to talking about that. Let's see. Oh, and there was a conclusion. I'll put up on the screen while I'm reading a picture of Venezuela, who is a transformista who appears in a documentary that was filmed between 1979 and 1980 and is released in 1981 by two filmmakers in Caracas. It's a documentary of life on Avenida Libertador at the time, and Venezuela is one of the key informants in this documentary. If we have time, I might play a little clip of her, of the documentary, in which she takes some of the people she works with on the street to a nearby fountain, and they engage in an act of national belonging. But I'll start with spectacular femininities. In Sandra Cisneros' homage to gay Tejanos and other people who have died from complications of AIDS, the character Rudy Cantu talks about his fame and fortune in South Texas. Rudy describes how he changes when he gets up on the stage at the travesty, how he becomes Tristan, the world-class dancer, dancing it up with La Calaca, death. I'll read a little excerpt from Remember the Alamo is the name of this story. When I was a kid and my ma added the rice to the hot oil, you know how it sizzles and spits? It sounds kind of like applause, right? Well, I'd always bow and say, gracias, mi querido público, thank you, and blow kisses to an imaginary crowd. I still do, kind of as a joke. When I make Spanish rice or something and add it to the oil, it roars and I bow just a little so no one would guess. But I bow, I'm still blowing kisses, only inside. Tristan is vital to Rudy's survival. The thrall that Tristan holds over the crowd is a symptom of his power. The crowd is there. The power to dance with death. But when he is not Tristan, when he is Rudy, the crowd is there. When he is Rudy, the crowd is there. When he is not Tristan, Rudy dances differently with La Calaca, quietly as he prepares his meal. Before an imaginary crowd, Rudy enacts an everyday small spectacle, witnessed by no one but his stove. But what is this spectacle? To whom is it directed? And why, ultimately, does spectacle, whether large or small, appear time and again among gay men and transgender women in Latin America and in other contexts? I propose in this chapter spectacularity as a register on which to consider the performativity of gender and how spectacularity is used to produce particularly legible forms of femininity by transformistas and actors in the Miss Venezuela casting system. Of course, spectacle is not the sole provenance of femininity. Masculine spectacle, racialized spectacle, commodity spectacle, the spectacle of the other, national spectacle, and myriad other forms of spectacle exist. For the sake of precision, I will parse out the definition of spectacle that I'm employing, which focuses on performativity and mediation rather than ideology. More precisely, I propose spectacularity as a mode of signification and performative practice that is related to mass mediation. Want to get that? For example, the imaginary crowd of Cisneros' story, of Rudy Cantu's everyday small spectacle, is an important component of spectacularity. Other elements, which I call mode of address and interiority, also attend to the performance of spectacularity. These elements reveal themselves as we move through a Miss Venezuela casting makeup session, which I won't read during this part of the talk, but I started to parse out exactly how this was working. And as an anthropologist, you often find yourself looking at things that you either make the familiar strange or you make the strange familiar, right? And so I found myself as somebody who isn't invested in my own kind of feminine spectacularity very much at all, who sort of spent my whole life doing the opposite of that and doing more masculine spectacularity. I found myself really interrogating, how do you actually make this performance happen? How does it work? And that's at the basis of a lot of the thinking in this chapter. Michael Warner's concept of publics serves to lay some groundwork for my definition of spectacularity here. And Warner's work is called Publics and Counterpublics. I'm much more interested in publics than the possibility of counterpublics. So if you're interested in that, we can talk more about it in question and answer. But that's why I'm not saying counterpublics, just so for the record. So I've proposed some ways spectacularity might work within an analysis of the performativity of gender by engaging Judith Butler's treatment of drag as an example of performativity. And I offer a few other examples. I'll just have time to run through one of them today. Butler's work on the production of gender through repetition and performance has provided an important framework for considering the relationships between discourses and bodies. When we approach these relationships ethnographically, the importance of accounting for context and the cultural specificity of signifying practices in Butler's framework becomes apparent. By what processes do discourses materialize bodies? This has been a persistent question in my focus on the body, and is the topic of the chapter that precedes this one. But spectacularity is an important dimension to consider in accounting for how gender is produced in and on the body within discourse. Spectacular femininities, then, are femininities that employ the conventions of spectacularity in their production. The concept of spectacular femininities allows me to account for the role of mass mediation and spectacle in the production and authorization of certain aspects of femininity as I observed them in Venezuela. I witnessed how spectacular femininities are invoked and produced in two different contexts. On the street with transformistas in Caracas, which is the part that I'll read today, and during the makeup session of a Miss Venezuela casting. Let me just forward here. It's another another kind of small spectacle in an out-of-the-way place. I'll say a little bit now about the topic of spectacle and gender in cultural theory. This is a huge area of analysis, so I will only say a little bit about it. But you'll forgive me for having to skip over wide swaths of the literature. The topic of spectacle has been of significant concern to cultural critics, particularly those linked to the Frankfurt School, which characterizes spectacle as an instrument of mass distraction. It's worthwhile to review some key approaches to the notion of spectacle and the relationship between spectacle and gender. Specifically, I engaged the work of Guy Debord, Marianne Doan, and Jean Baudrillard to map my own definition of spectacle and propose spectacular femininity as a way to consider the role of mass mediation in the performativity of gender. This is not a complete review of the copious amount of work that employs the concept of spectacle. Instead, I'm contending with the specter of false consciousness and instrumentality that underlines the concept of spectacle. And I distinguish my own approach as located within processes of subject formation and survival. Thus, I'm more interested in how people use spectacle than in making claims about critical consciousness or political possibility. Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle, published in 1967, describes spectacle not only as a manner of distraction, but also as the production of an entire society organized around the production and circulation of images and commodities. And if you've been following the elections, you'll probably see a lot of Debord in what's going on right now. So the spectacle, this is how Debord puts it, is an ongoing realm of social interaction. Since this influential text was published, commentary on spectacle has proliferated in media studies and cultural criticism. Debord proposes spectacle as an object, a social relationship, but this promising idea takes a different turn as Debord attempts to link spectacle to social power more directly. Debord asserts that the spectacle is capital accumulated to the point where it becomes image. In this formulation, resonant with Richard Dyer's analysis of stars as a kind of congealed capital, which there's a lot more to say about that, it would seem that Debord's spectacle is just the sort of bridge between discourse and the body that I've been seeking. However, with Debord, we never seem to end up at the body. As an all-encompassing phenomenon, Debord's spectacle becomes a logic, a thrall. In comments on the society of the spectacle, he likens the spectacle to the commodity. Debord's characterization of the spectacle as an ongoing thrall is akin to the notion of the media industry, although for Debord, the media is not a sufficient category to understand the power of the spectacle. Perhaps instead, this understanding of the spectacle is similar to an ongoing conversation or a fun cocktail party that has the power to make inconvenient things disappear. When the spectacle stops talking, Debord says, about something for 3 days, it is as if it did not exist. This is the idea of the news cycle. The spectacle then becomes a monolithic kind of power that blinds its spectators. Spectacle becomes reality. However, Debord's notion of spectacle depends on a passive spectator. another quote from Debord, the attitude that it demands is the same passive acceptance that it has already secured by means of its seeming incontrovertibility, and indeed by its monopolization of the realm of appearances. It is the sun that never sets on the empire of modern passivity. Again, very resonant with the electoral process this year. This is where, however, despite my sympathy to Debord's argument about the discursive power of spectacle, we must part ways. Debord's objectival notion of the spectacle doesn't serve to parse out the lived experiences of people with respect to spectacle, nor does it allow for a more complex understanding of spectacle as a cultural form, produced through specific histories, genres, and practices. A Miss Venezuela pageant might be considered the ultimate example of this kind of pacifying spectacle. But leaving it there at the production of the illusion ignores the vast amounts of labor, energy, desire, and preparation required to produce the pageant, the investment of its spectators and participants, and the meanings these practices create. Treating spectacle as a monolith erases the universe of negotiations, commitments, and disappointments that take place as people make their lives within the society of the spectacle. It is precisely this erasure in critical theory which does violence to lived experience for the sake of ideological positioning that motivates my own empirical project. We will have to forego an objectival notion of the spectacle and instead look for other ways to understand spectacle. I'm going to skip over the section where I talk about Marianne Doan and Joan Baudrillard, but I'm sure if you're interested in that, you can find it in the book. What I came to in thinking about spectacle is really more about what does it mean to be spectacular, right? How does it feel to be spectacular? Recalling the flight attendant in the introduction, I asked myself, was she being spectacular? The forms of femininity accomplished by transformistas and misses can be linked to spectacularity, to the idea of this mass-mediated kind of form of femininity. What I mean by this is that both forms of femininity involve a kind of hyper-femininity intended for display, and they are created as the objects of an imagined masculine gaze. Spectacular femininities, again, are femininities that employ the conventions of spectacularity in their production. This includes conventions of forms such as genre, narrative structure, temporality, and archetype. This also includes conventionalized gender formations, the tropes of femininity that render the production of these femininities as highly legible. So the forms of femininity that are available in mass media and are immediately recognizable as feminine. These have to do with morphology, or the shape of the body, affect, and iconicity, and are always inflected with transnational discourses of race, empire, and corporeality. In order to understand how spectacular femininities work, we have to look at conventions of femininity as well as the ways these relate to spectacle and the media through which spectacle can take place. So I'm going to give you an example now that I've talked a lot of theory at you. We all, along with the transformistas in the example that I'm about to give, employ elements of spectacle in our signifying practices. What watching transformistas relate to a video camera, as I do in this example, reveals is the humor, skill, irony, and sort of competence with which they employ spectacularity. By moving through this argument about performance, theatricality, and audience, I'm proposing that we consider spectacle as one register through which individuals can signify, a register that remains unaddressed in a theory of gender performativity. Our use of spectacularity in signifying practice, a complex and multifaceted form of citation, places us in a universe of symbolic resources and provides opportunities for imaginary projection beyond the material conditions in which we find ourselves. So it's going back to that idea of the imaginary audience. So the flight attendant is performing femininity not for the people who are in the rows of the airplane, although we're sort of witness to it, but actually for an imaginary audience that she is in dialogue with, right? And that's providing a kind of imagined recognition of her feminine performance. In the same way that the rice that sounds like applause is a little moment in which you can project this imaginary audience. And that's what specifically was the most significant finding for me about the way people do everyday spectacle. What makes something spectacular? Spectacularity, as I'm using it, employs existing conventions of media spectatorship to signify beyond a semantic level of speech. That is, spectacular performance is the kind of performance Judith Butler would call theatrical, like up on a stage, right? Only you do not have to be in a theater to be theatrical, right? How do we know when somebody is acting theatrically? I learned to identify this kind of spectacular performance on the street with the transformistas who worked on Avenida Libertador, which is a big area where transformistas do sex work. So the following story exemplifies the second and third elements of Butler's notion of theatrical performance, the mode of address to an audience, and the ways in which the performance is subject to interpretation. After the story, I'll probably skip this part, but I'm going to discuss this idea of interpretation. But this story is a scene that happened when I took a video camera out to Avenida Libertador, and it begins early one evening in Caracas, and I brought out on the street one of the video cameras that I was using to record beauty pageant castings. And it was the first and last time I brought the camera along during the Avenida Libertador fieldwork, particularly because of the amount of attention it drew from transformistas and in terms of the act of filming. So one of the things I realized very quickly is that when you get a camera out, everybody wants to play with the camera and project themselves onto it, and then everything else is sort of irrelevant. So if you're trying to see what people do every day, don't bring a camera. That's what I learned. I brought the camera to meet a group of transformistas who were getting ready for a procession that was to come through the area. It was an opposition march that was going on during the early period of the Venezuelan opposition to Hugo Chavez, who was the president at the time. The procession actually never came, from what we could tell, or the girls just decided to stay on the street and get down to work. But they were supposed to be marching down Avenida Libertador, and the girls were going to meet them from their usual workplace and then keep marching with them, but they never showed up. We stayed on the Avenida through dusk and into night. The group, somewhat led by Shaide, these are all names I had to come up with for people who were part of the study, was animated. Everyone was dressed to show off their bodies in close-fitting crop or bikini tops and jeans that looked as if they were painted on, of the low-rise sort known as the Brazilian cut. As I turn on the video camera, Shaide is cackling at something Andrea has said. Andrea motions to me to come closer and approaches the camera. "Hey," says Andrea. "Are we all going?" I ask. Right here," says Veronica. Andrea looks at the LCD screen viewfinder. "How ugly they all look." The three girls, Shaide, Veronica, and Pilar Alexis, say, "Ay." Andrea says, "Let me see how I look." Andrea is still focused on the LCD screen and is now using it as a mirror by pointing the camera in my hand towards her and flipping the LCD screen so she can see herself. Shaide says to no one in particular but the camera, "Today, February 12th of 2003, we are all going to the Not One Step Back March. Ni un paso atrás." Ni un paso atrás is the slogan of the opposition to Chavez at the time. Veronica chuckles at Shaide. Pilar Alexis is in the center of the screen. She keeps an eye on the camera and poses with shoulders back, smiles. Carla saunters across the screen in front of the girls and turns to look at the viewfinder with Andrea. Someone yells, "Ay." Andrea exclaims, "Look at Pilar." Pilar Alexis lifts her arm up and does a pin-up girl pose, bending at the knees and jutting out her butt. The high-pitched "ay" spreads through the group. Andrea moves the camera away from the group so she can check her makeup in the viewfinder. La Bambola jostles so she can have a look too. "All right, let me see," Andrea says. La Bambola says, "My turn. Hi, how pretty, ay." Veronica, Carla, and La Bambola all crowd into the frame with Andrea, push the camera away, and go off screen. Someone says, "Terrible." La Bambola screams and pushes in front of the camera so you can only see her teeth and silver lips with black lip liner. "Yo quiero salir." I want to be in it. Everyone laughs. The camera pans up and off. Andrea comes closer for another look. "Let me see myself." "Okay," I say. "I can't see myself." Carla jumps in front of Andrea, blocking her view. Andrea yells, "Move." Carla jumps off, laughing, and Andrea shrieks, "Hee, that's better." The jostle for the camera time is both about the camera itself, particularly Andrea's relationship to the LCD screen as mirror, and the social dynamics of the group. The fact that everyone is playing around is important. There's not a lot of sincerity about the use of the conventions that they're going to bring in, but they are what all of us slip into as the camera records. Andrea begins to fix her hair. La Bambola starts yelling at Andrea off screen. Hey, marico. La Bambola's arm enters the frame to push Andrea off. Marico, ¿hasta cuándo? How long are we going to have to put up with this? La Bambola jumps into the frame and assumes Andrea's place. La Bambola begins to fix her hair to everyone's laughter. I try to give some feeble direction, mostly to make sure I can keep track of everyone's name. All right, for the archives, please present yourself to the camera so a general chaos breaks out again. Shaide stays at the center of the frame. From off camera, Andrea shouts, "To Isherman, speak Isherman, a word for the cameras." From the way Andrea uses it, it seems that Isherman is the name of an announcer. She's already turned the video camera into a proxy for the press. Shaide begins to affect an on-screen narrator persona. Hello, good afternoon. We're here on the 12th of February of 2003. We're going to the march in favor of the revolution in Venezuelan democracy. We, the transgenders of Venezuela. My name is Shaide, and I will now introduce each one of the girls who work here on Avenida Libertador. First, we're going to call it Veronica. Veronica, my love, welcome. And the word that she uses to work is elaborar, which is a kind of like assembly manufacturing work. So it's actually trying to give a kind of dignified sort of characterization of sex work. So she's kind of taking on this smooth narrator performance. Shaide has studied communication and jumps at the chance to narrate. She's one of many transformistas who actually have been able to get through a college degree, but after they go into the job market are completely unable to find work as a result of workplace discrimination. So she employs the smooth conventions of an on-camera MC or reporter, addressing her audience and expressing self-consciousness about how she is received by affecting her language, choosing words like elaboramos and transgender, which are not commonly used on the Avenida. The camera pans to Veronica, who strolls on screen. Veronica's affect is fairly exaggerated. She swings her hips out wide as she walks, and when she begins to speak, she does so a bit haltingly, trying to sound breathless. Hello, my love, my name is Veronica. I'm from here, from Avenida Libertador of the Transfor. Well, I feel beautiful, I mean affectionate, I feel active as a transformista, and that's how I want to be. She flips her hair back with both hands and swings her head for the camera. There's a lot of hair flipping in this entire interaction. It appears that long, luxurious hair is an important sign for the performance of femininity on the Avenida. Veronica concludes, thank you. Shaide chimes in, yes, thank you, Veronica. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to call up now one of the beauties of Avenida Libertador. She is considered the Venus for tonight, and she is, of course, Pilar Alexis. Several of the group members off-screen proclaim, Lexi! They applaud and the camera pans to Pilar Alexis, who is far up-screen near the curb. She begins to walk over. Shaide says, Lexi, come here, pose for the press. Lexi saunters closer in her black bikini crossover top and enormous breast implants. She is clearly the vixen of the group, showing the most skin at this point in the night, and more interested in what's going on at the curb than interacting with the video camera. Pose for the media. Pose for the press, her friends say. Pilar Alexis says, how silly. She runs both hands through her silken black hair, which cascades midway down her back. Then with one shape, she flips the dark waterfall over her left shoulder and walks to the middle of the screen. She poses. She doesn't say much. Shaide jokes off screen about Pilar Alexis going to Los Angeles. Pilar Alexis stays quiet, smiling and posing. I say, well, we'll do a close-up from the bottom to the top. So I pan the camera. And Andrea to Pilar Alexis says, girl, but you're straight out of a calendar. Lexi pivots and does more pinup girl poses. And I ask her to introduce herself. She says, hello, I'm Alexis. She makes eye contact through the camera, flips her hair again, and glides off screen. Enough. She chortles and leans over to Shaide as the camera pans to both of them. Shaide says, all right, now we're going to call over one of the blondes. A gorgeous one, of course, no less beautiful. And she knows who she is. Let me present to you Andrea. The group cheers and claps with laughter. She saunters over from the curb where she has retreated with Pilar Alexis. Andrea's voice is low and streetwise. She speaks with a detached irony. What do you want me to say? What I do for a living? Andrea is making reference to the reporting of Erika Corrales, who is, at the time hosted a national scandal and gossip show called En Caliente, roughly translated as Hot Zone, on the Radio Caracas television network. The show taped on Avenida Libertador a few times, and Corrales would often dramatically confront transformistas and other sex workers on the avenue with this question: what do you do for a living? What do you do for a living? Andrea says, I am a prostitute on Avenida Libertador. La Bambola says, beautiful queen, beautiful. Andrea says, okay, so what do you want me to say? I say, present yourself. How do you feel today? How do I feel today? I feel divine and I feel young because I am still young. And that's why we're going to the youth march, I say. Of course, that's why we're going to the march today, all of the girls here. Having had her turn, Andrea waves goodbye and strolls off screen. Shaide resumes the narration, calling up an important trope of femininity in Venezuela. All right, we're going to call up last year's Miss Venezuela, Miss Bambola. La Bambola stalks forward from the curb in jeans ripped to shreds and a paisley halter top. She pulls a band off her hair and shakes it loose in front of her as she walks. La Bambola acknowledges her crown. Several of the girls have copied her silver lipstick with black eyeliner, but her lips are perfectly done. She says, of course, I am Miss Venezuela. Look at it, okay? Make note of it. She flips her deep red hair over her left shoulders and turns to Shaide. Shaide says, what gives? Are we going to see it all right now? Everything, everything? Ignoring Shaide, she asks me, what do you want me to say? I say, tell me your name. What's your name? Shaide says, what do you do for a living? La Bambola says, okay, my name is Bambola, and as you can see, I am 90, 60, 90. Miss Venezuela 2002, my love. 90, 60, 90 is like 36, 24, 36, the measurements in centimeters. Andrea screams in jest, how dare you? Someone in the back exclaims. Andrea yells, I'm the only one, and the only one who will dispense with the crown among transformistas because no one else will ever be like me. La Bambola shakes her hair in front of her face as she speaks, then turns away from the camera. Andrea instructs her, but look at the camera. La Bambola whips around and gives the camera a piercing look. Someone says, ay, diva. So I'll skip over a couple of the other interactions, but at the end, Shaide asks everyone to come together for a group shot with a video camera. Once Andrea has called everyone together, Shaide directs her attention to the camera once again. She says, okay, thank you. Thank you for coming along with us, the Venezuelan transgenders. Thank you for your support, for your solidarity, which is important. We're going to continue and present the entire group. What do you think? Everyone, get over here because they're going to take a group photo for the press. The group assembles as the light in the plaza darkens. Some of the group members stand on a concrete circle that serves as a bench. A car trolls nearby at the curb. The men inside catcall to the girls as they assemble themselves for the shot. They pose for a few seconds, then disperse. After the group photo, which is not a photo, some of the girls talk to the men in the car. Others hang out at the curb. In a while, everyone spreads out to different points on the pasarelas and starts to work. We never end up going to the march. In this story, transformistas hail each other and place themselves in discourse by citing conventions of spectacle, from Pilar Alexis' pin-up girl poses to Shaide's smooth girl reporter narration, La Bambola's Miss Venezuela, and even a demure Estoy para servirle of one of the other transformistas. Each transformista employs a different mediated persona or has one projected onto her by Shaide in the group. A significant finding here is that each girl knows exactly how to use the convention she chooses. So the distinctions that both Warner and Butler make between performance and text or language rely on a logocentric framework, which stubbornly maintains the difference between words and flesh in spite of the work both scholars have done to break down precisely this binary in queer theory. And while they both work to harmonize the binary, they ultimately stick to the text. This is a disciplinary decision, to be sure, but it's one that, for example, leads Butler to consider media texts such as novels and films, even in ethnography, as equivalent forms to examples of the everyday speech she invokes through experience, most evident in her use of drag as an example of the constructed and performative dimension of gender. This flattening of forms of speech is at the heart of the frustration with Butler's frameworks in terms of addressing racialization. If acts of speech are not embedded in the histories of colonization and racialization that have produced their contexts, they maintain ecumenically available for argumentation without relation to these processes. The question of what drag wear is paramount in considering drag practices as a set of examples. The queens represented in Esther Newton's Mother Camp are quite different from those represented in Jenny Livingston's Paris is Burning, and indeed quite distinct from the communities of individuals that have been the objects of these representational projects. And this is one of the things that I was trying to very carefully set down in my observations of the girls on Avenida Libertador. If we're to consider the performativity of speech acts or the performativity of other acts of speech that are not in themselves speech acts, we must attend to the ways in which these examples of speech have been produced. The issue of mediation, particularly with respect to the debate over Paris is Burning, is one of the things that gets lost in Butler's analysis of speech. Let's see. Speech acts are multidimensional. As Butler points out, the performative power of speech acts is not constituted by the words that are uttered. It is in the quintessential example of a speech act, that of a judge saying, "I now pronounce you," in a marriage ceremony, there is the authority of the person uttering the phrase and the citation of legal authority on which this phrase becomes binding. As Butler puts it, it is the power of this citation that gives the performative its binding or conferring power. But what happens to citation when it is mediated? That is, what happens when a speech act is performed in its local context, but then reiterated through a medium of diffusion? Does it signify differently? Take the example of crowning a Miss Universe as a speech act. And we saw an interesting version of this with Steve Harvey's mistaken crowning this year of Miss Colombia, who was replaced by the Miss Philippines, because he made a mistake and didn't he read the first runner-up as Miss Universe, so the example of crowning a Miss Universe is a speech act, right? In the moment her nation is announced and the crown is placed on her head, she is made Miss Universe by the authority, it would seem, of the Miss Universe organization, Donald Trump and NBC. But how is the performative power of this speech act constituted? What authority is cited in the conferral of the crown? It's different than a judge marrying, which is J.L. Austin's example of a speech act. While the corporate authority of the Miss Universe organization and its owners is undisputed in this speech act and performed by a master or mistress of ceremonies contracted by this organization, the public of the pageant confers an authority as well through its witnessing and recognition of the coronation. In 2009, this public was estimated to be more than 6 million viewers in the United States alone. And estimates of international viewership are unavailable, but the Miss Universe organization boasts an international audience of hundreds of millions of people, according to its website. The public of the pageant is constituted in various forms. The people attendant to its staging, the audience in the theater in which the pageant is held, the televisual audience, and now the internet audience. But beyond these constituencies of attention, the public of the Miss Universe pageant includes everyone, as Werner would say, within earshot, who might have made note of its occurrence. This is the fourth of Michael Warner's principles of publics. A public is constituted through mere attention. Warner's notion of attention, however, is fairly broad. And the active attention involved in showing up is enough to create an addressable public. So Werner says it's even possible for us to understand someone sleeping through a ballet performance as a member of that ballet's public. Thinking about all these different ways of relating to performance, right? Some kind of active uptake, however, somnolent, is indispensable. Without recognizing the scale on which Miss Universe is crowned, the nature of the public that lends its attention to this act, we lose the dimensionality of the speech act. Without scale, it becomes difficult to determine the significance of the speech act, whether it is uttered at one of many gay and transgender beauty pageants held throughout the world or in someone's living room. All of these acts have significance. They signify, but they signify quite differently. Mass-mediated audiovisual spectacle contributes another register on which to evaluate the productive power of speech, that of scale. Scale in this sense does not necessarily have to be mass-mediated, but the massivity of mass mediation is a clear example of scale as a register for speech. Without this register, all acts of speech seem to float around in the same semiotic ocean without the full weight of embodied context to anchor them. The ability to address a mass audience is an indicator of access to the means through which such audiences are constituted and addressed. When Shaide and Andrea riff off the conventions of address to a national Venezuelan or transnational Latin American audience, they are also using the massivity of this mode of address to hail an imagined audience, to place themselves in a particular location in the world order, one that is clearly not resonant with the material conditions that surround them, and yet important to their everyday performance of femininity. So I want to conclude by just reflecting on what's happened since the book was published, and since the time I was in Venezuela. As the years have passed and my companions in Venezuela have weathered hopes and disappointments, gradual change and fracasos, institutional apertures and bureaucracy, material decay, new possibilities, moral outrage and resignation, I have worked in the United States as its own political perversions and illusions have played themselves out. My focus always is on the frivolous, those people most excluded from political possibility because of how ridiculous the idea is that they have politics. It is in the lives of transformistas, of Translatina immigrants to the United States, making their survival out of impossibilities, that I have found the core of political possibility. It's not pretty though, and there are many moments when it feels as if my heart is falling out of my chest, despechos. As Queen for a Day went to press, Venezuelans experienced the despecho of losing the charismatic leader of the Bolivarian Revolution, Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias, in March 2013 after a long struggle with cancer. Many mourned, some rejoiced with rancor, and the Bolivarian Revolution marched on, for better or for worse. I spoke to friends in the wake of the funeral who talked about the deep transformation they had seen in the time since Chavez took power. Of this I am quite sure. Hugo Chavez transformed Venezuelan political culture and the political imaginary of the most marginalized Venezuelan subjects. He hailed people into citizenship who had previously not considered themselves agents of claims to the state. This resulted in a profound aperture in the government for LGBT projects, assuming, of course, their legibility as Bolivarian projects. This is consistent with other kinds of transformations in the shape of the state in Venezuela. At the same time, the government continues to reinforce a juridical and political climate that rejects mechanisms of identity and family recognition, and political culture still openly relies on homophobic slurs as forms of discrediting candidates on all sides. Although recently, a good friend of mine, Tamara Adrian, openly transsexual woman, was elected to the National Assembly on an opposition slate, and it's a very back and forth. A lot more imagination and world-making needs to take place to create a progressive environment for what is called diversidad sexual, or sexual diversity, in Venezuela. In Queen for the Day, I've shown the ways transformistas and misses invent the very possibility of their own survival, and the ways this survival reflects the realities of Venezuela as a product of modernity in the Americas. It's my hope that this book helps us pay attention to frivolity, glamour, imagination, impossibility, and melodrama as we struggle against the forces that marginalize us in the world, as we struggle to make a place for our lives. Thank you. So I think we have a little bit of time for question and answer, if people have questions.
We have about 30 minutes to entertain some questions, and if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, I'll give you the mic. So I have some comments from Twitter.
Oh, Twitter.
And Lavette Burnett says, this is really interesting. So I guess there are two questions. So is the spectacle for the audience or the feminine performer was one? Mm-hmm. And then I guess how would you apply this idea of feminine spectacle to young Black women? It doesn't say the context, mm-hmm. but maybe if you think about differently racialized subjects, what kind of conventions do they use, and what's the different kinds of currencies for those conventions depending on racialization?
Right. Well, I think that's a key question. That idea of, who is the spectacle for was really what sort of drove my questions about the flight attendant. And I think the spectacle is for the performer. I think the spectacle is for the performance project of self-making. And certainly there are spectacles that are produced for audiences very deliberately, but they are produced within a context of making all kinds of spectacle all the time for particular kinds of subjects. In this case, I'm thinking about femininity as a place for that spectacle to be made, but we could just as easily think about masculine spectacle. And in fact, in this chapter, I use the example of a young girl playing basketball in her driveway, saying she shoots, she scores. And that is an example of invoking that spectacle of basketball in one's own life to imagine oneself and one's body otherwise, right? And so we can think about that the role of spectacle as being very broad in that. So how does that work for young Black women? I think for me, that's actually not a question I'm well equipped to answer right now. I think young Black women have great answers to that. And employ all different kinds of spectacle, I think, depending on how they're gendered. I know, people who are female assigned at birth, who are creating masculinity on their bodies, are going to use different forms of spectacle than people who are creating femininity on their bodies, whatever their gender assignment was at birth. So, and all of these, of course, are going to be available to us within histories of racialization and representation, right? So, I think, my introduction to feminism's class was very excited whenever I would put a Beyonce video up. They got very, very excited because I think Beyonce is so available visually on this mass media level to so many people. But I think one of the points that I wanted to make in Venezuela is that actually it's not just that hyper feminine kind of performance that is available. So the very first drag show, I read about this in the afternoon at the seminar. I read about a drag show that I saw with Whoopi Goldberg as the primary persona that was being done in drag. And in the United States, you don't see a lot of Whoopi Goldberg drag, actually. The idea of Whoopi Goldberg as kind of being available for drag practice is really maybe not spectacular enough because her form of spectacle is a little bit less hyper-feminine, right? But in Venezuela, she was very much available as a kind of figure through her being an African American, I think, through the consumption of African American culture in Venezuela. So you have, for example, a big Afro-descendant movement now in Venezuela. A lot of it supported as a social network through the Bolivarian Revolution, but a lot of it, prior to that as well. But using hip hop and other kind of music forms to really articulate a place for Blackness in Venezuelan culture, in a culture that very actively erases mentions of Blackness, even as Blackness is used as a category of exclusion very, very deliberately, right? Not just from beauty culture, but also from economic opportunity, education, all these different areas of life. So yeah, I think that I would love to see young Black women coming up with the things that are significant to them in terms of spectacle and what works in people's everyday lives. I think there's also a big feminist critique of spectacle, of course, that kind of rejects the adoption of these forms of spectacle as ways of creating recognition and sort of legibility for women in general. It's this sort of idea that beauty queens are brainwashed, and basically, if they were only just develop a feminist consciousness, they would not want to be beauty queens anymore. And I think I actually am really interested in the kind of feminist guilty pleasures of spectacle, those texts and cultural forms that we interact with as guilty pleasures, even despite our feminist consciousness, because I think a lot of us have those. You kind of watching a performer or listening to a kind of music, and you might say, well, it's got terrible lyrics, but it's really danceable. I really enjoy it, right? And that is also an example of somebody, having a consciousness and being able to respond to a text for what's available to you symbolically in ways that are meaningful for you. So I think finding that kind of meaning is really important.
Trying to speak that back. Thank you. Right? Any other questions?
Yes. Way in the back there, and then you.
You talked a little bit about the queer diaspora. So many people talk. You'll have to.
So we get.
I was wondering if you talk about occupying that space, and what about occupying that space allows you to do the kind of interactive work that you do.
So a lot of the ways we think about queer diaspora that we're studying a specific diaspora, subjects in diaspora, people who have been displaced as a result of their sexuality, for example, people who have had to migrate. But actually, I think you can see queerly, like you can see in diaspora and you can see queerly. And diaspora puts you in places where maybe other people within that area of research might not have looked or might not have seen in the same way. It's a little bit related to standpoint epistemology, like the idea that kind of wherever we are positioned in society, we have a different standpoint from which to make epistemological claims. But at the same time, I think it's not unique to identity. It actually has more to do with where diaspora takes you in the world. How do you end up in the particular places if you start to kind of look at how you got to where you are through the people that made you, right? In some way, through the forces that have created your life as it is now. So a lot of things that I ask my students to do, I have a class called Queer Diasporas, is actually to trace back in their family history the disruptions and displacements that have placed them in California. I mean, anybody who ends up in California, unless you are Native American, from California, has gone through some level of displacement and disruption in order to arrive there, right? So the question of how do you end up in this place is a really important one to actually start to ask. What do you see as you go back through that? I think that works not just for people who identify as queer or people who are in diaspora, but also I think for us as we figure out the story of what our world is now, right? So that's kind of how I use queer diasporas. I mean, I think there have been other researchers who have really much more focused on studying queer subjects in diaspora. And I think that's a very valid part of thinking about this, but we often forget that it's actually about how we see the world, right? So there's a question here.
First, thank you for bringing your ethnographic work here to talk about. I appreciate it. What I want to ask you is, you spoke about the flight attendant and her performance with an imaginative audience. What I want to know is, did you find in doing your research in Venezuela that the transformistas did you find that they were in dialogue with their performance to an imaginative audience as a way of life? Like that is their life?
Yeah, sometimes when I think about when I was writing this section of the text, I was shying away from talking about the performances and the language that I use to honor the kind of spectacularity that these women are producing for the camera, for themselves really, because they're actually having a banter among themselves, and they know. I've already told them that I'm not making a documentary. This isn't ever going to be broadcast anywhere, but they don't really care because it's not really about me. It's more about what they're doing that afternoon on Avenida Libertador. And so I think it's vital to them in other contexts too. Without cameras present, it's vital to these women to project their feminine legibility and to be recognized for it. I think that it's a big struggle for many of them because they can't walk down the street without getting called out, without getting insulted, without being sometimes violently attacked. They can't walk down the street during the day. They can't go to the shopping mall. At this time, when I was working in Venezuela, I would talk to people who just stay in their house all day and not leave their house until they left to go to work, because anytime they walked out on the street, they would be attacked. So this notion of spectacle, I think, even though what I'm reading sounds very trivial, it sounds like people are just kind of clowning on the street, it's vitally important to a kind of recognition that they're not getting every day in their lives. And in some ways, virtuosity of that kind of femininity makes people give them respect as women, right? That ferocity, that kind of diva persona commands respect in a way that they don't often get respected. So I think that's what's important about it. Thank you. Yes?
What is it you study, which is fascinating, especially with the active audience, the video audience? How does that work with there's kind of thinking about not just the performing, but also the relationships, the
a good question, because I think about that solitary performance in the kitchen in Sandra Cisneros' story, and sometimes that is actually a very lonely act. It's not about building community, it's about creating recognition for yourself in that moment, right?
Also imagined community.
Yeah, it is definitely conversant with that idea of imagined communities and this idea of the imaginary audience. I think there's something to be said about that, about nationalism, and well, not nationalism, but that the way that Benedict Anderson thinks about the imagined community of the nation. I think you can use that optic to think about audience, and I think it can be very powerful. But in terms of community building, I think that when I was talking about theatricality, theater and theater performance actually does do that, very deliberately builds performance and community. And I'd say that these everyday performances, to a certain degree, create interaction and sociability, but also sometimes they're actually more distracting than actually making real, like they're making some kind of real connections. For example, there's a lot of berating that goes on in this scene that I read, particularly of one person who, I didn't read that part of the scene, but who gets basically called out as country. And so there's a hierarchy among the women who are presenting, and the one who is sort of the most seen as the most beautiful gets called Miss Venezuela, and everybody else is sort of, down the tier below her. It can be kind of competitive, and I think you probably got a sense of that from the reading. But they, so I want to not make too many claims about what kind of community building it does,
It's very layered on.
Uh-huh.
But I'm
Yeah.
curious in terms of a larger sense of we're able to accommodate each other because we are for that part.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that they're definitely on the street together, and they're building community through that, occupying that space. But I would also say that our notions of community are so inflected by mass media attention, right? So mass mediated forms of recognition, that all of us sort of do that. We build community through consumption of media products, even if we're doing that consumption completely in isolation from other people, right? So that notion of community actually comes packaged with mass mediation in a way that I don't think we pay enough attention to when we think about spectacle. Yeah, good. There's a question right here.
Hi. When you started talking about glamour, you talked about how it reorders time and space. I think I get the space part, but can you talk a little more about temporality?
Yeah. So this is actually about mode of address, and I had this really great experience. I was trying to explain mode of address to my 260-person lecture course, and you get the sense when you're actually when somebody gets singled out in a, so like right now I'm talking to you, and the interaction between us has a different temporality than when I'm addressing a larger audience and not specifically talking to you. And it's a very minor difference in terms of what's going on in this room right now, but the attention of this room is now on the two of us in conversation with each other, right? And so when I did this in my Intro to Feminism's class, there was a couple people with pink hair in the audience, in the students, and so I actually said, you with the pink hair, and looked directly at one of them, and then I found the other person with pink hair, said you also with the pink hair, and so that idea of like who the you is. That how as a way to illustrate interpolation, right? So that process of interpolation has a phenomenological dimension, right? It has a felt experience that is related to being hailed. And then we don't often talk about, because we talk about interpolation as an ideological function, we don't talk about the bodily state of interpolation. And so what that means, I think it can feel very different to different people. So if I'm interpolating, like if I'm hailing you from a position of authority in front of a lot of people, it can feel terrifying, right? It can create dread in your body, right? Or it can create like a euphoria, right? If I'm recognizing you positively. I don't know that I have the power to do that, but a really good orator might. But that is actually very significant in terms of how we experience being part of an audience or being seen, right? Both of those things are happening. And so I think it's really about paying attention to the body in that moment, and trying to be very careful about thinking about what are the consequences for our bodies as we are recognized and hailed. So I'm wondering, I think I'm missing a part of what you asked me, but is there another?
Go back to time.
Oh, yeah, the temporality. Yes, sorry. So the question of temporality is a really interesting one, and as you know in the seminar, I talked a lot about temporality. But oh wait, no, you weren't able to come to the. But anyway, I've been thinking a lot more about time and space through black holes and time travel. But the idea of temporality, we often are dominated by a sort of clock-based metric notion of time, which in fact we don't experience. So if you've ever had like that pregnant pause in a room where the professor is waiting for somebody to say something, and you just let that silence stay, that silence, which might last 30 seconds, can feel like 5 minutes, right? Depending on what your positioning is in that. So when I say temporality, I think we have this ability to shift our concept of time as we interact with each other and as we hail each other, right? And so when somebody walks in, makes an entrance into a room, somebody who's very glamorous and like everybody's head turns to see that person come in, they have shifted the organization of time, and we're no longer doing what we were doing before that person came in. We've all turned around to see what that person is doing, and we're sort of paused, waiting for that person to do something, and then just as quickly we can pay attention to something else, right? And so that to me is a function also of temporality and not just attention, right? Thanks. Any other questions? Yes?
I sure hadn't asked this, but I kept thinking of Maria Lugonis in this.
Yes.
The notion of playfulness. I heard a lot of playfulness in you, but also in your subjects. And I think some of us tend to, I see a lot of gender presentations that are so deadly serious. There was just such a contrast.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because playfulness, if you focus too much on it, people think you're not actually being serious, and that you're not actually thinking about serious, weighty things like life or death, right? And this is a big problem in queer theory. People often think that sort of sexuality is the last thing that people need addressed. They need their bread and butter, sustenance figured out first, right? But actually, questions of sexuality are key to our understanding of our lives in the world, right? Sexuality, gender presentation, these things that are often seen as supplementary and not core issues. And we've moved past that in politics, I think, in a way that understands intersectionality a lot more, and the intersection of all these different factors as having as being of great consequence. But I think so when I was writing this book, I actually got some comments from the peer reviewers that basically said, Venezuela sounds like a lot of fun. Like, can you say a little bit about the violence that people are living through, right? And I thought, well, I mean, it's true, like that people do live through a great amount of violence, and I write about it. But we are so used to representing transgender subjects in particular, and third world subject as always experiencing violence, that it was vital to me to have space for playfulness and joy and dreams, because I think without those things we don't survive these kind of deadly systems, right? So I appreciate that you saw the playfulness in there, and I think it's for the people that I worked with in Venezuela, it was vitally important to be able to make fun of things, to be able to crack jokes, to be able to be inappropriate in these spaces where they already knew people didn't want them there. They already knew police were going to come around at some point and try to get them out of there. They already knew that people were going to throw bottles at them or try to shoot them, because that happened regularly on the street. And yet there they are, vamping in the middle of the street. So for me, that's such an important act of defiance and resistance to something that is trying to take away their humanity. So that's why I focus on it. And I appreciate the reference to Lugones. I haven't read much about playfulness with her, so I'm gonna, that's in Pilgrimage, I think, in the Peregrinajes book. Yeah, but I mostly worked with her coloniality of gender concept, which I think is really rich and valuable idea. But I will go back to Lugones.
Essay, Playfulness and World Travel.
Oh, okay, yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's the main source.
Yeah, I'm gonna write that down. No, I'm definitely going to look back at that. Lugones is interesting, as we've had some nice discussions. In fact, at the next National Women's Studies Association, I'm on a table. The whole theme is decoloniality. It's going to be in Montreal, which is a great place to think about decolonizing. Lugones is going to be on this table with me and Chela Sandoval and Laura Perez, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm with these amazing people. So we're going to get to think about this there. So hopefully we'll see you at the next NWSA. Let's see, so playfulness. I have to make my
Time
notes.
for one last question. Well, if not, let us give another hand to Dr. Ochoa.